When we got to that village, near it, the little children playing on the perimeter of the village gave the alert. And the people came hustling out of the village. It's a very small village, only about 70 people. And as they rushed toward me, I had entered into something that is described as the peak experience. It is that which emotionally one experiences that nothing ever in the rest of your life can transcend. And I feel certain that is what was my experience that morning in that village. When the people came, I saw among them a short man, compactly built, an off-white robe, a pillbox hat. And when they got closer, the interpreters with me, sure enough, went to him. And meanwhile, the 70-odd people of this little village came rushing toward me. They came quickly, curiously around me. They were around me sort of in a horseshoe design. Had I held out my arms at full length, I would have touched the nearest ones on either side. And they were about 3-4 deep all around. And the first thing that got to me was the intensity of how they were staring at me. The eyes just raked from head to foot. Their foreheads were furrowed in the intensity of their staring. And I felt very, very discomforted being stared at as if I was a thing or something. And the first thing that got to me was I began to have now another feeling. It was also in me, and yet it seemed apart. It was visceral, as if my insides were going to churn around or something. I felt almost nauseous. And I remember standing up there thinking to myself, what in the world is the matter with you? And what came to me was that I had been in crowds lots of times in my life, but for the first time in my life, I was in a crowd and I was the only one of my complexion which might be said to be brown. Everybody else I was looking at was jet black. And emotionally, that thing hit me like a thunderbolt. I, to this day, don't know the components of why I felt as I did. And you know, it's sort of like body English. If we are insecure, uncertain, whatnot, we tend to drop our glances. And I dropped mine, and without having intended to do so, I found myself looking, almost studying my own hands, the color of my hands, inside, outside, and naturally, involuntarily, it's in contrast with their complexions. And this time it didn't take so much time. I had this rolling wave of a feeling come over me. It was just terrible, awful. I felt hybrid. I felt impure among the pure. And it was just awful. I remember standing there being rocked by that when the old man left the interpreters and briskly walked away, at which point all the people around me quickly left me and went to the old man. One of the interpreters, his name was Salah, came up and spoke quickly, whispering sort of in my ear. And what he said rocked me as much as the rest when I understood the import of it. He said, why they stare at you so, they have never in this place seen a black America. And I suddenly realized they were not looking at me as Alex Haley, writer, individual, as I tend to think of myself, but they were seeing me through their eyes as the symbol of the 25 plus millions of us black people in this country whom they had never seen. And it was just awesome to realize that someone had imputed to you that enormity of symbolism. Well, I was standing there kind of rocked by that when just sort of adjacent were now all these people, 70 odd of them, clustered around this old man. And they were darting glances at me, and there was intense conversation in Mandinka. And although I couldn't understand a syllable of it, yet in some way there's a universal language of gestures, nuances, inflections. And somehow I knew exactly what they were talking about. I knew they were trying to arrive at how did they feel collectively about me symbolizing to them all we black people in this country whom they never had seen. And there came a point when the old man turned, and quickly as was his way, he walked right through the people. He walked right up to me, stood maybe a yard from me, his eyes piercing into mine, and he spoke in Mandinka as if he felt I instinctively ought to understand it, which of course I couldn't, and the translation came from the side. And once I understood the import of that translation, or the words, I made a vow to myself that once I get this book and the film and everything all settled down pretty well, I am going to see these words put in some appropriate permanent location somewhere along the southern coast of this United States and along the western coast of Africa. the way that they decided they felt about me, symbolizing to them all we black people in this country whom they never had seen. And the translation was, quote, "Yes, we have been told by the forefathers that there are many of us from this place who are in exile in that place called America and in other places." And that was the way they felt about it. The old man, the griot, his name was Keba Kanga Fofana. He had 73 reigns, their way of saying 73 years of age, one reign a season a year. He began now to tell me the history of the Kente clan. I should tell you that one of the most awesome things I have since come to try and deal with was that if, and this particular if ought to be in letters 6 feet high, because it is so rarely possible because of intervening occurrences, nonetheless, if any black person in this auditorium, any black person in this country only could know a few vital clues, if he or she only could know what was the original African name of the forefather, the foreparents brought out of Africa, if he or she only could know when were they brought out and from where were they brought out, that to this day it is not impossible that the contemporary black American might be put in touch with a wizened old griot somewhere in backcountry black West Africa who could tell the contemporary black American literally the ancestral clan from whence he or she sprang, if they could know those clues. I was there, blessed to know the things I had gotten through a series of miracles which had begun on a West Tennessee front porch from my grandmother and other elder relatives. And now I was about to hear the story of the Kente clan, because I had been able to say, as had been the case, that my forefather in this country always had insisted his name was Kente. I should tell you that when a griot begins to speak, it's a neo-religious occasion within a village. The people get in a wide semicircle. Their posture is something kind of like parade rest. The griot sits. He comes forward. As he begins to speak, he bends forward. His torso is rigid. The cords stand out in his neck. He speaks, and the words are almost as if a scroll is being read. He would say 2 or 3 sentences, and the interpretation or translation would come to me. When I had heard a good fair amount of it, I was absolutely awed, immersed in just wonder that such could be, that out of this man's memory and his mouth was coming such an incredible array of lineage, all the way across a family line 100-odd years ago, who married whom, what children in what order, all the way across that line, then drop back down to the children themselves, each child whom they had married, their children in what order, all the way across. I was struck by the biblical way it was being expressed in the translations. And so took as a wife so, and begot, and begot, and begot. And every now and then when he would name some begot or other, he would tell some little thing about that person which had happened later in life. I can strip out of the hours I was to hear that day into a few minutes the history that I was to hear of the Kente clan, and I again remind that the counterpart of this history exists this day is somewhere in backcountry black West Africa for every single black American there is, if he or she only could know the clues and only could be put in touch with the right griot. He said that the Kente clan had been begun in the country called Old Mali. The men preponderantly were blacksmiths. The women were mostly potters and weavers. A branch of that clan had moved into the country called Mauritania, and it was out of Mauritania that one son of that clan, his name Kadereba Kunta Kinte, had come. He was a young Marabout, which is to say a holy man of the Muslim faith. The people of that section, as I've said, historically were predominantly Muslim of faith. Kadereba Kunta Kinte, as a young Marabout, moved down into the long, narrow country called the Gambia. He stopped first in a village called Pakalinding, and then he went to a village called Jifarong, and he went next to a village called Jufaray. In the village of Jufaray he took his first wife, a Mandinka maiden whose name was Cyrene, And by Cyrene he begot two sons, whose names were Janne and Salum. Then, Muslim man, plural marriages, he took a second wife, her name Yesa. And by Yesa he begot a son whose name was Omero. The three sons grew up there in the village of Juphere, and when they came of age, the elder two, Janne and Salum, went away and founded a new village called Kinte Kunda Janne Yah. And then the youngest of them, Omero, stayed there until he had 30 years of age. Then he took a wife. Her name was Binta Keba. And by Binta Keba, within the decade that we in our calendar system would call roughly between 1750 and 1760, Omero Kinte begot 4 sons, who in the orders of their arrival were named Kunta, Lamin, Suwadu, and Mahdi. The old man had been talking for about in excess of 2 hours when he got down to that level of the family. Then, as he had stopped, I would suppose 50 times, it would seem, in the course of that time, to tell some little tangential thing about some individual, some begot or other, he stopped now and he spoke, and the translation came from the side. And I heard in disbelief. It began about the time the king's soldiers came. And I interject to tell you that's one of those time-fixing references which griot storytellers use to fix events. They use events to fix dates. And if you would know the event, you must find the date. But anyway, here in backcountry Black West Africa, hearing the ancestral story of the Kinte clan told because I had been able to come, saying my forefather had always insisted that was his name, now I heard this wizened old griot say through the interpreter, quote, about the time the king's soldiers came, the eldest of these 4 sons, Kunta, went away from this village to chop wood, and he was never seen again. And he went on with his story. Well, I sat there as if I was carved of rock, goose pimples that felt to be the size of grapes all over me. There was no way in the world for that man to know what he had said to me. It was with physical effort that I got my hand into my duffel bag and got out my little notebooks. The first book, the early part of it, was devoted to a kind of a synthesis of what Grandma and Aunt Liz and Cousin Georgia and Aunt Vine and all of them had said. And I showed it to the interpreter Salah, and I watched as he read, and he began to perceive the meaning of it. And he got very agitated. He went to the old man, talking very rapidly, explaining to him. The old man, after a point, all but grabbed the book, jabbing his finger at its pages, talking very rapidly to the people, explaining the significance that I had come from a place where my forebear on this side had been one who always said his name was Kinte, who had always said he was not far from his village, chopping wood, with the intent to make a drum when he had been surprised, set upon, captured into slavery. I remember I had been sitting on a little 3-legged stool with a cowhide top, and I just felt like helium had been pumped into me. I popped up like a jack-in-the-box, just stood up. I don't remember anyone giving an order. I just remember subsequently becoming aware that those people, the 70-odd of them, had formed a circle, a ring around me. They were sort of dancing, it might be said, of kind of hitching progress dance, counterclockwise, the movements kind of like drum major. It's the high knee action. They were chanting something, their voices alternately loud and soft. And I'm standing there in the middle of them, feeling like an atom in the desert. How could you feel? I felt wiped out. And I remember I happened to be looking right toward the face of one of the about 12 ladies in that moving circle who had little infants over their back the way they carry them in those cloths, as this lady with a fierce scowl on this shinola black face broke from the circle, charging in toward me, her bare feet knocking up little puffs of dust. And when she got to me, she took her infant and all but thrust it at me, the gesture saying, take it, and I took it and I clasped it the way we instinctively do babies. And as soon as I had it clasped pretty good, she all but snatched it away from me, and there stood another lady with her baby. And it went on. I suppose it took about 2 minutes for me to hug all those babies. I would be back in this country, speaking at Harvard University, and a very famous scholar in this country, Dr. Jerome Bruner, who knows of such things, said later to me, you were participating in, and you did not know it, one of the oldest ceremonies of humankind, called the laying on of hands. That in their way they were saying to you, through this flesh, which is us, we are you and you are us. And there were many, many other things that were going to happen that day in that village, almost too emotional to try and deal with. One I remember was the men took me to their mosque. I didn't know what to do. I'm Methodist, they are Muslim, and I was trying to be careful to do the right thing, watching out of the corner of my eye. You take off your shoes to go in there, you're down on your knees, and I remember down there on my knees feeling so forlorn and lost and thinking, I've found out where I've come from, I don't even understand what they're saying. They were praying around me in this high nasal wailing Arabic. And later when we came out, the crux of what they were praying was translated for me. It was, praise be to Allah for one lost long from us, whom God has returned. And things just went on till it got to the fact that emotionally I could not handle anymore. I told them I wanted, if I could, to go out by land. We had come by water up the river, and it turned out it was long enough after the rainy season. It could be arranged. And I was going out now, it was set up, I would go out with a driver in a Land Rover. Backcountry, Black West Africa. The monkeys, the incredible foliage, the green parrots that streak around screaming at you. Just backcountry sight sounds that I'd never had any idea about, because you just cannot describe Africa unless you've been there. And as we were going along, there was also in my mind a great turmoil. There began to come in my head as we might have a dream, as when we sleep. A rough, ragged newsreel type of thing. It was as if all that I had read by now about the ways that Africans had been brought out of Africa seemed to be enacted. I began to see the way that along in the coastal areas, as had been the case with Kunta, mostly they were people who were kidnapped because they were close to the coast. But further back inland, I began to see the way that by far most of the slaves were captured, come screaming awake at night with the thatched roofs of their homes falling in on them, a fire, a flame, the thatch was in flames, and they would rush out into the bedlam, into the carnage, and those who survived it in any kind of fit shape were captured as prisoners, linked neck to neck with thongs into what were called coffles. If you do much reading in this, you will run into that word coffles, C-O-F-F-L-E-S. It is said that some coffles of slaves were as much as a mile in length, and they would begin those tortuous marches from wherever the villages were down toward the areas where the ships were. And when they got down, with many dying along the way for many reasons, and when they got to the shoreline area, the survivors were herded into long, low buildings built of small timbers and thatched roofs called barracoons. In the barracoons they would be washed, they would be fed, almost force-fed, they would be crudely medicated to hurry them toward a fit physical condition. When it was considered that they were in sufficient condition, now a few at a time, they would be moved out into the yards of the barracoons, and there the owners of the ships would come, the captains and the mates, and there would ensue these hideous physical examinations, every orifice of the human body, and then the purchases, and then the branding, usually between the shoulder blade, usually with the initial of the ship that was going to take them out. And then would come the time, as I pictured it in my mind's eye from things I'd read, that they were being moved from the barracoon across that strip of beach to the little cockleshell canoes at the edge of the water. And when these Africans, from the inland areas, many of whom had never seen the sea, they were terrified. Those who saw the surf march up the beach, to them it was the jaws of some incomprehensible animal. They'd never seen anything like that. A ship lying offshore was to them a floating, flying house, or something like that. They didn't even know what a ship was. It seemed it was when those Africans were being moved from barracoon toward the canoes that for the first time they began to perceive the enormity of the unknown that was in store for them. Because it was on that beach that I had read so many times that so many of them who up to this time had been virtually stoic went into absolute spasms of terror. They would fall prone on the beach. They were groveling, they were screaming. They would use their fingers like claws digging into the sand. They would use their necks and heads like the beaks of giant birds, trying to bite up one last hold on the land that was their own. And they were beaten up from that, beaten down across the further beach onto and into those canoes that took them out through the surf, out to the ships. And it was into the holds of those ships that they were put. And that was how the ancestors of every black person in this country without exception were brought here. There were no exceptions. There was no other way. And I was riding along with my head so full of this when we came to a big village up ahead. And I looked up ahead and I was astounded to realize that those people up there knew what had happened behind us in the village of Juffure. Obviously they knew. Obviously someone had come out and the news had relayed ahead of it before I had left. Because ahead of us now there were poles staked along the road. There were green liana vines hanging like the cords from microphones, but thicker. And at intervals along these vines hung the great glossy green saboa leaves that Africans or Gambians use for sunshades or umbrellas. And the people were thronging out into the road, milling, waving. We could see them as we approached. And they were crying out some cacophony of sound. And we came on the driver slowing down. When he finally got to the people, I guess he was doing then maybe 2 miles an hour. And we were trying to nudge, he was, through the people who were all jostling and crowding around. I didn't know what to do. Again, I felt this full of helium feeling. I just stood up again like a jack in the box, now in the Land Rover. And I'm looking down at these people who are jet black all around, wizened elders and all ages and sizes and whatnot. And it came to me, looking at them staring up at me as they waved, what a huge caprice it was. There they were looking at me, seeing me as the symbol of all we 25 plus million black people over here, and I in turn am using in effect our eyes looking at them, seeing people who have never left Africa since the beginning of man so far as we know. And the huge caprice was that the only reason either of us was in either place was that caprice of which of our forefathers had happened to be taken out of Africa and which had been left there. That was the only reason either of us was in either locale. And I was full of that going on in among those people when I suppose we had gotten about a third of the way through them, and I suddenly began to understand what it was that they all were crying out. I think I hadn't understood it because I didn't understand their tongue, and they were all closely clustered, and I didn't get anything but the wall of sound as opposed to the individual sounds. But it began to come to me now that what they were all crying out, from wizened old elders, the men, the old grandmothers with skin like leather, their breasts like old belt straps, the childbearing women, many of them pregnant, the maidens, the youth, and the little youngsters, jaybird naked of both sexes. They were all milling, thronging, looking up at me with beaming, buoyant expressions on their faces. And what they were crying out, which I had not understood now, until now, was Mr. Kinte, Mr. Kinte. And I tell you what, I am a man, but I remember when a sob hit me about ankle level, I remember throwing my hands up to my face, my fingers, and shrieking, crying. I don't think I ever cried like that since I was a little baby. It just seemed to me that if one really knew the story of black people, if one knew the way that our forefathers had been brought here, that it really didn't matter what one thought about black people individually or collectively, but it just seemed that as a human being, one ought to weep that that thing called slavery had ever happened in the annals of human being, and I just couldn't help it. I wept on out through that village and all the way, more or less, until we got back to Dakar, and I got myself onto a flight back to New York. And when I got there, I found that it took me a while to get used to being back, about half a day. that I couldn't even call my own people. And then I called my brother, George, and he told me the sad news that while I was away, Cousin Georgia had died in Kansas City. My brother's a lawyer, he's very orderly, and he brought me a folder with the data about the funeral. Then it included the hospital report, and on there was time of death. And I went the way I sort of fiddle around with information, and I made the time transfer from Kansas City to West Africa. And then it hit me like a thunderbolt when suddenly I realized what had in fact happened, that as the last survivor among them all, Cousin Georgia, the youngest, who had told the story to me and to whom I had gone back several times since our reunion, because she was my source of strength, my source of support, my source of story, my source of history. And now it seemed that as the last survivor, one of the reasons that I have to feel that this whole thing was meant to be was that the time transfer, or the transposition of the time zones from Kansas City to West Africa, showed that Cousin Georgia had died literally within the hour that I had stepped foot in that village in Africa. And it always since has seemed to me that as that last survivor, it was her role to see me to that village where the link across the ocean in the family story would be made. And then Cousin Georgia, too, went on and joined the rest to watch me and see what would I do with it. It was a charging moment and a kind of motivation that it is hard to put to words. I got myself together emotional enough to go to the publishers, and I told them the story of what had happened. I told them that actually I wanted to write a book that technically would be the story of a family, my own, but which broadly would really be the saga of a people. That every black person, it does not matter who he or she is, ancestrally traces back to some African, born and reared in some village, captured in some way, put into some ship, brought across the same ocean into some succession of plantations. And I told them that what I wanted to do now was write a book that would be the symbol story, the saga of all black people. And it would be a book called Roots. I told them that I had to have what we call in the writing business saturation research. And they said they understood. It meant that I would try to bring every possible thing to this book, every avenue of research, everything I could commit myself to. And what intrigued me now, and it was because of my Coast Guard background, was the ship that had brought Kunta over. I had some clues. When I was a little boy, Grandma and the others always had said that ship brought him to Annapolis, they would pronounce it. There was no place they could possibly have been talking about but Annapolis, Maryland. It was at that time I did a little quick reading, a burgeoning young city vying for supremacy as a port with Baltimore. Numerous ships came in and out of Annapolis, some of them slave ships on occasion. I had another clue, and that was that now I knew where the African Kunta Kinte had come from, the Gambia River. And the next thing I needed to know was about when had this ship sailed. And now I had a clue for that too, as the old griot had said, prefacing his story of Kunta Kinte, he had said about the time the king's soldiers came. And I had to find out what was he talking about.